Today, before the United Nations Security Council, the Secretary General criticized the Ethiopian government for recently kicking out UN aid workers. He urged the government to allow aid to flow into the northern region of Tigray, where for almost the past year, Ethiopia and its allies have been fighting an ethnic regional force. And now, a warning from the very beginning of this story. The images are disturbing. Hundreds of thousands in Tigray are starving. And as Nick Schifrin reports, as fighting continues, the very real specter of famine looms.
In Tigray, children are dying.
When you see malnourished children, you will see a very distended abdomen, and you will see some swellings also in the extremity.
Until a few months ago, Dr. Hailum Kebede was the acting director of Eider University Hospital in Mekelle, the capital of Tigray. He shared photos that were taken last month.
The one in a ventilator is unable to breathe properly because he is getting weak and weak. You see a very pronounced head. And the other kid, if he cannot get a continuous supplement, then the kids will die.
Kids are already dying. In the last 3 weeks, Tigray TV, which is run by the Tigrayan government, broadcast these videos from outside Mekelle. The children are in rural Tigray, where conditions are even worse. The UN says 400,000 are facing famine. The crisis began late last year when Tigrayan forces who used to run the country attacked a federal outpost. Federal forces and their allies from neighboring Eritrea and the Amhara region waged a scorched earth campaign and occupied parts of Tigray. But in late June, Tigrayan forces pushed federal Ethiopian soldiers out of Tigray. That's when senior U.S. officials say the Ethiopian government and its allies effectively blockaded Tigray. In September, 5 convoys of food entered Tigray. The UN says it is 1/10 of what's needed, and the UN has been blocked from bringing in any fuel or medicine.
Medicine is running out of stock, and we used to give also food and also some supplements. You know, we have around 60 intensive care malnourished children in our hospital, and out of these, 6 has been died the last week because we don't have anything that we can give them.
Will those other 54 children die?
Yeah, definitely they will die.
So the combination of lack of medical care, most of the health institutions there are inoperable, and lack of food will mean that people will start to die.
Last week, the UN's top humanitarian official, Martin Griffiths, sat down with the Associated Press for a rare interview. After it aired, Ethiopia kicked 7 UN aid workers out of the country. And UN officials say whenever aid workers arrive, Ethiopian government officials take away their phones and cameras, anything that can record. Kebede was able to speak to us because he now lives in Baltimore.
Is the federal government blocking Tigrayans from sharing these images with the world?
Yes, the government is blocking all communication. The reason is just not to reveal what's happening in Tigray.
Can you hear me?
Over a sketchy Zoom line to Mekelle, I spoke with Mulugeta Gebriot Berhe.
We're just going to have to be patient, I think, because we lost you for a few minutes there.
He's a former Tigrayan fighter turned academic and UN mediator.
We're seeing the peasants are surviving on, wheats and flours that they have never used before. Because they have literally nothing to eat. If the world didn't act properly, it could be witnessing another disaster similar to that of 1985 in a very short period of time.
In the 1980s, famine killed 1 million Ethiopians. It, too, was man-made. And Tigrayans warn this one could be worse.
The encirclement was not 360 degrees as it is today. This time, the siege is a complete siege.
The Ethiopian government accuses Tigrayan military forces of fueling the conflict by sending soldiers from Tigray into neighboring Amhara and Afar and blocking aid delivery. They call Tigrayan forces and their political arm, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front that used to run the country, terrorists. And Human Rights Watch accused Tigrayan forces of killing civilians indiscriminately. Ethiopian Deputy Prime Minister Demeke Mekonnen spoke at last month's UN General Assembly.
In Ethiopia, groups that consider equality as subjugation are making their best effort to create and prolong anarchy. At this stage, we are nearly convinced humanitarian assistance is a pretext for advancing political considerations.
Tigrayan forces admit they've crossed borders, but Berhe, who says he's now a member of what he calls the resistance, is unapologetic.
There is massive mobilization of the people. They're just saying, nobody is going to save us. The world has forgotten us.
And to talk about Tigray, I'm joined by Mark Lowcock, who until July was the UN's top humanitarian official and was outspoken on Ethiopia. He's now a fellow at the Center for Global Development. Welcome to the NewsHour, Mark Lowcock. Is the Ethiopian government trying to starve Tigray?
Yes, that's what's happening. And your piece, thank you for doing your piece, because there's not just an attempt to starve 6 million people, but an attempt to cover up what's going on. What we're seeing play out, I think, is potentially the worst famine the world has seen in the 21st century. And everything that you've said in that piece is corroborated by what I'm seeing privately and what I'm hearing from lots of other people who have insight and who are able to extrapolate from the limited information there is about what's really going on in the places we can't see.
You use the word cover up. The Ethiopian government accuses Tigrayan forces of blocking aid and committing abuses in neighboring regions. Are either of those claims true?
One of the things that needs to happen is that the Tigrayans do need to pull back from some of the advanced positions they've taken up. But it is not true that the Tigrayans are trying to blockade. What's happening is that the Ethiopian authorities are running a sophisticated campaign to stop aid getting in by, for example, making it impossible for truck drivers to operate, by setting up checkpoints with official and with militia people, by preventing fuel getting in. And what they're trying to do is starve the population of Tigray into subjugation or out of existence, but to avoid the opprobrium that would still be associated with a deliberate, successful attempt to create a famine taking the lives of millions of people. The Tigrayans desperately want assistance, and it is not being allowed to get into them.
The U.S. is threatening further sanctions on the Ethiopian government. Is Europe doing enough to pressure Prime Minister Abiy?
And I think it would be a good idea for European countries and others, in fact, to stand more clearly behind what the US is doing and work with them and the African Union on the mediation effort led by President Obasanjo. What is in danger of happening is not just a total catastrophe in Tigray, but the disintegration of the whole of the Ethiopian state. The loss of 30 years of development progress and throwing the whole region into turmoil.
In 10 years of war in Syria, President Bashar al-Assad has evicted 3 UN aid workers. Last week, in one day, Prime Minister Abiy evicted 7 aid workers. How concerned are you, and could it exacerbate the famine?
Well, the reason those people were thrown out was because the Ethiopian authorities did not want them to be able to see what was going on. And it is a very unusual thing, as you've said, to throw people out like that. And the Secretary General of the United Nations has made clear, speaking to the Security Council, that what happened is not acceptable. But we just need to understand why this has happened. It is part of the cover-up. And what that tells us is the Ethiopian authorities do not want the world to see what's going on. And that's why it's so important to keep describing the events that are playing out.
As you said, Secretary General Antonio Guterres this afternoon criticized the Ethiopian government, but he, in fact, has been criticized for not doing enough. Do you believe the UN should be doing more?
Well, I know how hard Antonio Guterres has worked on trying to persuade the Ethiopians that their best interests are served by getting into a mediation and dialogue process. The UN has to do 2 things always in these circumstances. Firstly, persuade people in power and authority to give them access to people who need help. And secondly, to raise money. Now, in this case, the money is not a problem. There is money available. And so the UN has to keep trying to persuade the Ethiopians that their best interests are served, as well as their legal obligations are best discharged, have to be discharged by letting aid into northern Ethiopia. And I know they will keep working on that.
Do you believe it's possible to pressure Prime Minister Abiy when, at least in the capital, the war is popular, and he and other Ethiopian leaders historically have been much more concerned about domestic politics than international opinion?
every country has to pay attention to what the wider world thinks. What I think is particularly interesting is how sentiment has swung against the Ethiopian authorities over the last 3 months or so in Africa. The statement we heard from the Kenyan ambassador to the UN basically said to the Ethiopian authorities, you're making a big mistake. You need to step back. You need to allow aid in. You need to get into a dialogue process. And you need to stop listening to those people, those siren voices who are telling you to give war a chance, because war will destroy your country. That's the message from the rest of Africa to the Ethiopian authorities. And ultimately, I think they're going to have to pay attention to those kind of voices.
Mark Lowcock, thank you very much.